I'm trying to get harder and tougher mentally and physically every day of my life.
You're either the growth mindset or you're the fixed mindset.
If you're trying to be the best, you need to look at who the best is and see what they do.
Relentless pursuit of progress.
There's a difference between the best and the rest.
Welcome to the Brute Strength Podcast.
Champions are built in the mind first.
Where we interview scientists, world champions, doctors, and experts in just about every area of health and fitness.
What do you care enough about? What are you fascinated enough about to go so deep and learn so much that you'll know more about it than anyone else?
And now, here's your host, Michael Cazayoux.
Hey, this is Michael Cazayoux, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. Today, I'm joined by one of my all-time favorite authors, Sebastian Junger. Sebastian is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Perfect Storm, Fire, A Death in Belmont, War, and Tribe. He's also an award-winning journalist, a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and a special correspondent at ABC News. He is also a documentary filmmaker whose debut film, Restrepo, was nominated for an Academy Award. And guys, his book, Tribe, absolutely changed my life. Where I grew up in Louisiana, community was very highly valued, is very highly valued. And so I think I grew up already knowing how important community was, or already feeling like community was important. And when I read this book, it just cemented into me that it's not community and friendship is not a nice to have, but it is something that is so deeply hardwired and ingrained in us that it is a necessity, almost like the necessity for air, food, and water. And since reading his book, I have progressively and at times aggressively moved towards having more and deeper ties in my community. And at this point, I just feel so fulfilled in my community and by my sense of community, the friendships that I have around me. And so much of that has to do with me reading this book. Specifically, what we talk about on the show is topics like why colonists in America, when early settlers were taking over from the Native Americans, whenever these colonists would be captured by natives, many of them, when they were offered their freedom again, would end up staying with the natives. And that never happened in reverse. There's no documentation of a Native American being captured and then being offered his or her freedom and saying they wanted to stay with the colonists. That never happened. And we talk about why that is. We talk about why war can often feel better than peace at times, why natural disasters are sometimes good for community, why mental disorders are often worse in affluent communities or higher end communities, and the importance of depending on others, and maybe even more importantly, feeling like others depend on us. This guy's work has had such a huge impact on my life, and it was such an honor to get to speak to him. And I'm so excited for you to get to listen to this conversation. So without further ado, please help me welcome Sebastian Junger.
This episode is also brought to you by Jambo CBD. If you're not already on the CBD train, then I'm sure you've at least heard of it before, because many people thought in the beginning that this was just a legal way to get high. And unfortunately for some of you, you can't get high on CBD. You can try, but you can't get high on it. On the other hand, it can help you sleep better. It can reduce stress and anxiety. It can be huge for pain relief and reducing inflammation. Personally, I've had knee pain for about 5 years now, and I haven't been able to figure out a way to get rid of it. I haven't figured out the root cause. I've worked with PTs and chiropractors, and I just haven't been able to eradicate it. So I have used some pain relieving techniques, and this is one of them. I've used Jambo's extra strength 200 milligram balm, and it absolutely does not completely take the pain away, but it makes it manageable. It allows me to get into a deeper squat. It allows me to walk around and just go about my daily activities without feeling much pain at all. And whether that's placebo or not, I really don't care because I just don't feel like I'm in as much pain. I've also used their sprays, and there's a really subtle relaxing effect to the sprays. So that's pretty great. It's helpful for sleep and reduces a little bit of like a feeling of tension in my chest, which I often call anxiety. It's great for athletes and recovery. And some specifics and what sets Jumbo apart is that they have 100% natural ingredients, full spectrum CBD sourced from Colorado and Oregon. They have CO2 extracted oils that are, I think, safer. They have therapeutic grade essential oils in a lot of their products, third-party lab tested, so it's legit. And they're one of the first CBD companies to post their lab results publicly. I also know the owners of this company very well. They're very close friends of mine, and I trust them deeply. Again, my favorite product of theirs is the 200 milligram extra strength balm. I've also used the sprays, but they also have drops and butters or ghee. I think ghee is like a butter type thing. So there's all sorts of different products. And they're offering you 15% off of anything in their store. And you can get access to that by going to JumboCBD.com and use the code BRUTE in all caps. That's BRUTE in all caps. A couple more things. So a huge plus of their sprays and drops is that they use MCT oil. So since CBD is a fat soluble molecule, it binds with this oil and allows for much more rapid and effective absorption of the actual CBD. It also has essential oils that add flavor, and they bring their own proven health benefits as well. With the Muscle Bomb, since they use ghee as the base, again, ghee is like a butter type thing, the CBD is binding with the ghee fat, and it's able to be carried all the way to the bones. Ghee itself has amazing topical healing properties, and when CBD is added, the results can be pretty profound. So again, you can get access to this discount, 15% off of all of their products by going to JumboCBD.com and enter the code BRUTE, all caps, at checkout. Go get them. Sebastian, what's up, brother?
Hey there, how are you?
I'm great, man. Thanks again for making time for me, dude. This is such an honor. I think I mentioned in the email exchange that we were having, but your book was absolutely life-changing for me. And so I'm just I feel giddy being on the other side of this microphone with you right now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
So with COVID-19 and now the racial issues that are going on in this country, I believe your work is more important than ever. Personally, I've always had this sense that community was important. I grew up in a really small town where people really value community. However, it wasn't until I read your book that this idea of community and the importance was really cemented into my mind. And your book single-handedly is something that caused me to consistently take action by way of making community one of my, if not my top priority in life. How did your focus on this research all start for you?
Well, I noticed something interesting when I was, I grew up in, a sort of affluent American suburb where people didn't know each other very well, and there was not really any community at all. And I was I was conscious of that when I was a teenager, and I really didn't like it. I knew it was sort of wrong, and by wrong I mean unhealthy. And then I had this sort of profound experience when I was embedded with American soldiers in Afghanistan in 2007, 2008, in a very dangerous place called the Korengal Valley. There was a lot of combat. My colleague and I made a documentary called Restrepo that showed what it was like there, and that got a lot of publicity. I was with these 30 guys in this, this very remote finger of rock getting shot at, all the time, off and on for a year. And I couldn't believe how good it felt. I mean, I couldn't believe how good it felt to be in a group of people where everyone was reliant on each other, even reliant on people they didn't like very much. But everyone was reliant on each other, to survive, and not only survive physically, but survive psychologically, emotionally. And when the deployment ended and I finished my work with those guys, I had a lot of psychological problems, and it wasn't. I don't think it was trauma. I don't think it was grief. I think it was loss. I mean, I think I was struggling with the loss of human connection. I'm an anthropologist. I studied anthropology in college. I see things through that lens, and I realized that a platoon of 30, 40, 50 people is exactly the size of the typical human living group, typical human community in our prehistoric past. I mean, we evolved as a species to live in groups of about that size. That's exactly what a platoon with. And so I started to develop this theory. Maybe what resonates so deeply in a situation like that is the fact that it's the scale and scope of a very ancient human experience, and that when soldiers come back and have a hard time readjusting, in addition to the trauma, if they were in combat, in addition to the trauma, one of the things they have a hard time readjusting to is the fact that they're no longer in a group. They're in this wide open Western society. And that would explain why a lot of these guys that I knew said that they wanted to go back to Restrepo. Like they didn't want to be in the United States. They wanted to go back to that awful place, but it wasn't awful. And that's how that idea started to sort of crystallize in my mind.
Sort of along similar lines, one of the most striking parts of your book was the fact that early colonists in America that were captured by Native Americans, when offered their freedom, often would choose to stay with the Native Americans. And in the book, you say that never in recorded history, not once did that happen in reverse, where a Native was captured by a colonist and they chose to stay. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think people are drawn towards community, and even colonial society was very hierarchical, which is not pleasant. And even colonial society had less community than a tribal society in the wilderness. And so, there's a letter from Benjamin Franklin to a friend, sort of tearing his hair out, like, we're a moral Christian society. Why is it that when white people are like kidnapped and spend even a year with the Indians, like they don't want to leave? Whereas when the reverse happens, the Indians are always dying to get back to their people. Like, why is, if we're a superior society, why is that happening? And it really troubled people at the time because, of course, they thought of European society as morally superior and Christian and all those good things. And it really troubled them that people would be like actively making a choice to go towards the heathen, with the barbarians, right? And of course, it was attributed to the work of Satan. But actually, of course, Satan is a stand-in for nature, and I think it was an entirely healthy response. We need people. We need people around us. One of the psychologically the very, very hardest things for people is to be on their own. And the sort of irony and the tragedy of modern society is that as we get more affluent, as a society, we can afford to have our own apartment. We can afford to commute 50 miles to work, that we're not working with the people who live around us. That affluence allows us for autonomy, which is also great. I mean, autonomy has a lot to be said for it, but it does make us more vulnerable to psychological troubles.
Another thing you talk a lot about in the book is the human desire or necessity of feeling necessary. And a quote that I pulled from the book is, "Humans don't mind hardship. In fact, they thrive on it. What they mind is not feeling necessary. Modern society has perfected the art of making people not feel necessary." Can you say more about this?
Yeah, I mean, you could think about it in these terms. We're social primates. We don't have claws. We don't really have teeth. We don't run very fast. We can't climb trees very easily. We're very vulnerable, right? I mean, humans alone in nature die almost immediately. But we survive in groups. In fact, we thrive in groups. So your safety, and when I say safety, I mean your physical survival, your physical safety, but also your emotional, your psychological safety. They're all tied together. Your safety comes from the proximity of other people you trust. And the surest way of guaranteeing that group that you're with will accept you and take care of you is if you're giving something necessary and helpful to them. If you were just sort of added baggage and not contributing to the group, you're only there at their pleasure, right? I mean, they're indulging you. right? They're like, okay, we'll take you on even though you're not doing anything for us. If you're providing something essential, then you can be secure that your place in that group is strong.
Wow.
And,
yes.
Right. So when people retire, when they get fired, when they realize that they're superfluous, it triggers a very deep human anxiety because it means the group doesn't need you. And if the group doesn't need you, you may not be part of that group for very long, and then you're on your own, and then you're screwed. In evolutionary terms, then you're screwed.
Yeah, people that are cogs in the wheel of a large corporation just cranking out widgets or just following a script that their boss, wrote out for them, they must feel pretty unnecessary as well.
Right. When you can be replaced very easily, then your survival is not guaranteed, right? I mean, you're in this group that you need, but it doesn't need you. That's a vulnerable place to be. Any small-scale tribal society sort of needs everybody, right? I mean, everyone's involved in food collection and in building shelters and taking care of the children and the million tasks that living in the natural world requires. But likewise in a platoon. I mean, every guy in the platoon had a job. There was the guy in the radio, the 240, and the saw, whatever. Everybody had an important job. And so even if you weren't personally well-liked, if you were a great radio man, you were good. You're not going anywhere. They need you, right?
Yes.
And that feels very, very good in, ancient human terms. It's interesting when you look at statistics, generally as affluence goes up in a society, the depression rate and the suicide rate tend to go up, right? I mean, what's sort of interesting is that the affluence is correlated with an increase in psychological issues. And poor societies, for all the stresses of poverty, the lack of material wealth forces people to collaborate more. I mean, maybe literally even pulling water from the same well in the village, right? I mean, maybe even literally at that level, they collaborate more. And that leads to an increase in mental health. So it's one of the ironies of affluent society is that that's where you get the really high rates of addiction, some kinds of addiction, and depression, suicide, PTSD, all those social ills.
Yeah, man, this resonates with me so much. I mentioned I grew up in a really small town in Louisiana, and Louisiana is always like 49th or 50th in terms of the poorest state in the country. And yet I think it was the only state in the United States that was a part of this documentary called Happy. And they found that people in Louisiana are amongst the happiest on earth. And I think it's because of this sense of community. When something breaks down in my hometown, they don't just order something new off of Amazon. They call their family members, they walk over to their neighbors, they call their friend who's also a carpenter, and they just figure shit out. And it causes more collaboration, more working together. And looking back on it, it's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, the study that I looked at compared North America and Nigeria. I mean, I've worked in Nigeria. It's a very poor, very corrupt, very, very difficult, impoverished place. And so what they found was that compared women in North America and women in Nigeria. And they found that in both countries, women in rural areas had lower rates of depression than women in urban areas. And urban women in North America had the highest rates of depression. And rural women in Nigeria, this incredibly poor country, had the lowest rates of depression.
Wow.
And that's not because what they weren't evaluating was help seeking. I mean, it's not that, okay, in North America, there's shrinks and people go get it. This is the World Health Organization conducting certain mental health surveys around the world and tabulating the data. And what they found was that the poorer and the more rural the community, the psychologically better off people were. Of course, they had other huge challenges, but it's interesting in evolutionary terms to contemplate the possibility that even in physically hard circumstances, living in a close connected community buffers people enormously, buffers them from psychological challenges.
So what are some of the other key ingredients in community? We've got the desire to feel necessary and to contribute. What are some of the other key ingredients?
Well, I think overall, the idea that you're not in this alone, that a group needs you and that you can depend on the group, that you can be sort of honest and authentic about who you are, about your identity, that the leadership is egalitarian and fair. All of those things, when you see leadership that's taking advantage of their power, that's incredibly demoralizing, because what it communicates is that there's no group here, right? I mean, a group is where everyone values the group more than their own welfare, because they have no future without the group, right? You die without the group.
Yeah.
So you might as well put the welfare of the group first, because without it, you're dead anyway, figuratively or literally. When leadership put themselves first in front of the group, what it makes it feel like is that there's nothing you can trust, right? And so, for example, in 2008, after the financial collapse in this country, there were a dozen key figures in the financial world who were sort of instrumental in producing that collapse. And it cost us $14 trillion. The unemployment rate doubled. The suicide rate skyrocketed because it's correlated with unemployment. I mean, a lot of bad things happened. And not one person was prosecuted or put in prison for
insanity,
causing an enormous amount of damage to their country. I mean, it's a form of treason to do that.
Yeah.
And they did it knowingly. They did it for their own, personal financial interests, and no one was held responsible. So an American citizen, Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter, could reasonably think this is a group that's not protecting itself. And if it's not protecting itself, it's not a group. Like, we don't belong to something that considers itself to be a group, or it would be raining hell down on these people. They're criminals, right? And that, I think, was very demoralizing, even unconsciously, to the American public. I think it was a really horrible thing to watch those people get away with what they did without any consequences whatsoever.
Man, this is an important conversation right now. Is there a North Star? Like, is there a country or a region of the world that is sort of the North Star in your mind in terms of community?
Well, I mean, so a country can't be a community except in a figurative sense. I mean, a community is a group of people that you more or less are familiar with and recognize, and you just can't do that with 400 million people. But that's not to say that we can't conduct ourselves in a way that respects and reinforces the strength and the dignity of that group. So this is the new experiment in human history. Like, this is new. Trying to run a group of 350 million people, that's never been tried before, right? And that doesn't mean it can't be done. But one of the things you have to do is bring this sort of values, the interpersonal values that create a healthy group at the level of 50 people. You have to try to bring those same values to a system that can govern 350 million. And that's hard to do. But, one of the things you have to do, in my opinion, is you have to get contempt out of the public discourse. Family therapists will tell you, couples counselors will tell you that couples can come in fighting all day long, no problem. When they speak with contempt to each other or about each other.
How do you define that?
That's a predictor of divorce.
How do you define contempt?
Saying things that signify you think the other person isn't worthy of you, that they're somehow illegitimate, that they somehow don't want good things for the relationship, that they're actively trying to sabotage what you're trying to have with them. I mean, that's contempt. That they're beneath you. You shouldn't have to deal with them because they're beneath you, right? So in the platoon that I was with, I mean, there was plenty of tension between guys, right? It was 30 guys on a hilltop getting shot at. They certainly didn't all love each other, but they all needed each other, and as a result, they never spoke with contempt about each other. They had criticisms, they had frustrations, but no one ever said, you know what? you shouldn't even be here. You don't even deserve to be up here with us because you're not worthy. That was
Right.
never said. And if someone actually thought that about someone, there was a real issue that had to get worked out. So what you have right now in this country is this sort of active use of contempt by some leaders, some political leaders and media leaders about their fellow citizens, right? You never show contempt for people you're sharing a foxhole with because you will need them,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you may be saving their life or they may be saving yours. So you really don't want to talk with contempt about them. So the people that use that kind of rhetoric in political discourse today, basically they're saying, like, this isn't a combat outpost. This is America. We can act, in unhealthy, sloppy ways and still survive. That's nonsense.
Right.
Like, this country can get turned into a combat outpost overnight, as we found out on 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of contempt for political adversaries is completely toxic, and it's covered under free speech. I'm not saying there should be laws about it, but there should be political conventions and political repercussions that penalize that kind of completely grotesque misuse of our public communication.
Agreed. How have you integrated this research into your own life? You mentioned that you grew up in an affluent society and battled with, a lot of the things that you talked about in your book, and then you discover this golden wisdom. How has this impacted your own life?
Well, I have never, after age 18, I've never lived in a suburb and never will. I just make sure that I live in places where I can feel some community connection. As part of our lives happens in New York City, and we live in a sort of neighborhood that's economically very, very mixed, and some very poor people, some more affluent people, but it's all mixed. Is very the social fabric in that neighborhood is very tight. People know each other, they help each other. There's some gangs and stuff, but I know those guys too, and whatever,
Wow.
We're good. And I would be very, very unhappy not living in a circumstance where the social fabric around me wasn't important, wasn't part of my daily experience.
And how does that happen? How does that community in New York City with mixed economics, how do you stay connected to each other? How does that actually look?
Well, it happens because it's by necessity. So when Hurricane Sandy hit, a lot of people had children and there was no, the power went out, so there was no water in the buildings, and people with young children, had to leave, right? So, which means the buildings were empty. So these are not, these are mostly Dominican and Puerto Rican Spanish-speaking people. They're not affluent people, right? And most of my building is Spanish speaking, and they they left, and that meant that their apartments were vulnerable to being robbed, right? So one of the women that stayed organized guard shifts at the front door and she had a machete, and she organized guard shifts at the front door just to make just so that the guys from other neighborhoods are cruising around. They knew that, like, no, this building, we got this. Like, don't even think about coming into this building. That's a communal solution to a problem, right? But even I know it's very dramatic, right? But even at this sort of like in New York, you got to move the cars for street sweeping, and if you don't, you get a $60 ticket, and so like, but sometimes that's hard, and so like the guys that are down on the street corner will buzz me if the meter maid's coming, because if I'm not down at my car yet, whatever. Like, there's a lot of help, a lot of reciprocal help. The lady that, she has a couple of kids and she gets groceries at like 1,000 pounds of groceries once a month or something. I don't know. It's some huge expedition when she gets her food. And so, if I happen to be going through the lobby, it's a walk-up tenement, obviously. And if I happen to be going through the lobby, I'll just stop what I'm doing and I'll help carry all that stuff up for her. So, it's like, it's that kind of stuff. It's not super simple. It's not super complicated.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. We had a house before the house that we're in right now that had a huge yard, and it had a big fence and a gate. And, I kind of grew up thinking that was the ideal, right? We want more space so we can run around and stuff like that. And I think we talked to 3 neighbors over 2 years. Everybody spread out. No one came, almost no one came and introduced themselves because it's not even necessary. Now we moved to this place where all of the houses are much closer together. And within 6 months, we know like a dozen neighbors and we just feel more connected, even though, we're not relying on each other for things. We're serendipitously running into each other. We're having more conversations. I run over and grab eggs or flour occasionally, and it just feels like it's literally more of a community.
Yeah. No, listen, humans have been doing that for 200,000 years. So, that's what feels good. It's right. And it's what feels good.
So with COVID-19 and now this racial inequality issue that is very active at the time of this recording, it seems undeniable that we have to learn to work together more. How do you think your research and ideas can be applied to all of this that's going on in our country right now?
Well, one of the ironies of COVID is that working together means staying physically apart, at least 6 feet apart. And, people in families, self-isolating in their, where they live. And I mean, it goes against all of our human instincts for when we feel under threat. When we feel under threat, we gather together, and it happens instantly and very naturally. Hurricanes, tornadoes, civil wars, whatever. People do that very, very naturally. And that process of gathering together often feels so good that people will reminisce and be nostalgic about the crisis that they survived, the Blitz in London or whatever. People can be very nostalgic about things like that, even though objectively there were horrible circumstances, but it brought people together, and that there's sort of a net gain in well-being when that happens. So here we are, we're in this huge crisis, but we actually can't physically be together. I have a flip phone. I don't do a lot of social media. I just have stayed away from that whole world. But I do understand that it obviously can serve a good purpose. And so one of the ways we've maintained our sense of community is through social media and other ingenious ways. In New York at 7 p.m., people shout out the windows their appreciation for the healthcare workers that are risking their lives taking care of people. Very, very moving, very, very moving thing, right? So there are sort of ways to work around that enforced distancing that unfortunately is a part of our lives right now. And the racial injustice and the protests and all that. I mean, it's tragedy, and it's a complete violation of the ideals around which this country was formed. And we all know it. Some people claim they don't, but they know it. Somewhere in their heart, they know it. I think. Again, you have to apply the standards that you would use in a close, small community to the whole community.
Yeah.
So if you lived in a group of 30 people and one of them was, needed some sort of restraint or intervention, would you really do it by putting your knee on their neck and killing them? No, probably not. You know what I mean? That's probably not what you get to do with the other guy on the soccer team that you play with that is like a little out of control right now or whatever like that. So why would we in a nation of 350 million? It's the same standards, right? We're trying to do something almost impossible, which is apply ancient human norms to an enormously large group. And you have to really, really try to bring those human norms, small scale norms, up to that macro level. And if you don't, the macro will not hang together. It will fall apart.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of an experiment or multiple experiments that you think we should or could try that may move us in the right direction here?
Mental experiment.
Or not mental, just experiments. And I say experiments because obviously it's so complex. We don't know for sure. No one knows for sure what will work.
And move us in the right direction in what sense? In terms of racial justice, or
racial justice, exactly.
Well, I think it's happening. I mean, I think the experiment is happening. What happens when the mayor of DC paints Black Lives Matter, in yellow letters 100 feet tall
Mhm.
across the boulevard that leads to the White House that now has a new fence around it.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a pretty cool experiment. Yeah, what's going to happen? You know, like, we are an experiment. We don't need experiments. We are an experiment. Every day is a new experiment, and then the country's changing. And if we can't keep up with the changes and protect all of our citizens and give all of us the respect we all deserve, we will not survive as a nation.
Mhm.
America will not survive as a nation. That may not be the end of the world. Nations come and go, you know, whatever. But I think it would be a pity, and I don't think it has to happen. But there's some really toxic voices out there that are clearly not focused on the unity of the country, but are rather focused on the welfare of their own personal welfare or of their subgroup.
Mhm.
And those people really have to be socially and politically sidelined.
Yeah.
They're
So-
a threat to they're a threat to the security of the country.
Yeah. So you've got young kids. Y'all have been bunkered down together since COVID started. What is this conversation, or how is this conversation going, if at all, within your household with your children?
My eldest is a little over 3 years old.
Okay, so not much.
Yeah. So she, you know, we've explained about what a virus is and why
Mhm.
people wear masks and why we can't see dear friends of ours, you know, very close up,
Mhm.
and that the virus is in New York, and when we're not in New York because there's a lot of virus in New York, and out here there's less, and you know, he's put it in those terms. She gets it.
Gotcha.
Her younger sister is 5 months old and doesn't need things explained to her.
And how about race? How is this conversation going in your household outside of with your children, or in your just in your world?
Well, my 3-year-old doesn't have access to the media, and so she doesn't herself know what's happening out there. My wife and I talk about it, but we try to do it in terms that aren't too upsetting. There'll be a moment where we explain things to her, but we're not quite at that moment yet. She's only 3, so I don't think. I mean, you know, she grew up. My eldest daughter, her name's Aisha. She grew up in New York mostly, and you know, I don't think, you know, in a neighborhood that's completely racially mixed,
Mhm.
and in a building that's racially mixed, and with parents who have friends who are racially mixed. And honestly, I don't think she draws any distinctions whatsoever between the races.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
You know, I mean, I grew up in a white suburb, and I'm an enlightened, liberal thinking person. But honestly, I think it took me some time in my life to really sort of like recover from the racial isolation that I grew up in, and I'm well rid of it. You know what I mean? Like, good riddance. But you know, my daughter won't have to do that, and that's a really, really cool thing.
Yeah, that's great, man. Well, Sebastian, this has been phenomenal. I know you're on a time crunch. You got kids just waiting to spend time with you. Before we leave, do you have any last words of wisdom to leave people with that are interested in building community and feeling more community in their lives?
You know, I mean, mostly I would say if something feels good, it's probably good. You know, like if spending time with other people feels good, if helping someone, you know, like dig out their garden, or helping a neighbor dig out their garden, I don't know, whatever it is, like something that you've done for other people, if that feels good, it's probably good for you. It's probably good for the community. In that sense of, you know, and this is so confusing to soldiers, the war felt good, and it felt good because they were with each other.
Yeah.
And so I've been very careful to say, listen, it doesn't mean you're a psychopath. It means that you're a human being, and the close proximity of other people that you trust is a kind of drug. It's good, it's healthy, and you need to find that back home without the combat, right? And you know, likewise, I would just say, like, if you pay attention when things feel good and solid and right, like that's a clue that you're on the right path.
Amen, man. So I know you're not on social media, but if people are interested in keeping up with all of the work that you're doing and they want to be aware of your next book when it comes out, where can they keep up with you?
My next book will be out just about a year from now.
Okay.
It's called Freedom, and it's a kind of discourse on that complicated idea. My website is sebastianjunger.com. Junger is how you spell my last name. And that has all my films. I'm a documentary filmmaker as well as an author. It talks about something called Veterans Town Hall, which is a community event organized around veterans. It's pretty interesting. So anyway, SebastianJunger.com will bring you up to speed on all that stuff.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for your time, Sebastian.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Your journey towards better fitness continues. Head over to brutestrengthtraining.com to connect with Michael and his guests. Access links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. That's brutestrengthtraining.com.